has authored several books, which are now available in 15 languages, 6 European languages, 6 Indian languages, and 3 Far Eastern languages. So may I ask you please to welcome Vishal Mangalwadi. Over to you, Vishal.
Thank you, Prabhu. It's wonderful to have you and Andreas organize these events with distinguished resource people. Professor Guptara was responsible for leadership training in what was then world's largest bank in Switzerland. And now he's a publisher. They've just published their first book, which is focused more on India-related themes written by Indians or non-Indians. So he's the main organizer and, as you will see, the moderator for many of these events. And these are organized by European Revelation Movement, which is incorporated as Truth and Transformation. And we are still in the process of branding ourselves and having our own YouTube and Facebook, etc. So until we get there, we're using these interim Facebook, YouTube, which go in my name, but I don't actually manage them. The team is managing them. But this is all a voluntary effort. Your contributions are invited. You can donate to Truth and Transformation in Germany or Revelation Movement in the USA. Both are tax deductible, and your support is greatly appreciated. So thank you very much. I will listen and hope to get back into the conversation later.
So the bank, and these think tanks were major issues that nobody else in the bank was looking at. So that was my particular responsibility. It did occasionally include speaking at leadership development occasions, etc., but that was by the by. That's just a short correction. But the focus today, of course, is on world organizations. And just a reminder that world organizations have existed for many years, probably going back to the Sumerian civilization or Phoenician civilizations and so on. But these were rather more informal organizations based on trust bonds across supply chains, primarily commercial ones. And non-commercial global organizations started emerging with the rise of communication technologies at the end of the 19th century to begin with. And then, of course, later on, these technologies enabled us to have better and better and closer relationships, with the result, of course, that the conflicts between people also became closer and closer to each other. In other words, you were at war with people who were further away from you. And of course, the technologies to deliver deadly things developed so that we could do it at greater and greater distances. So now we are in a global civilization where there are global threats and, of course, global opportunities. From the global opportunities, we benefit, for example, through occasions like this, when we can learn from each other, discuss things with each other, and if we were business people, trade with each other for the benefit, of course, of both parties. And it's through that trade that technologies have developed, and the possibility of books such as those that are behind nearly all of us, the availability of clothes made in different parts of the world, goods made in different parts of the world, and so on. So we benefit hugely from this. But of course, as I said, we make the opportunity also for conflict. And as industrial society has developed, there has, of course, come about the challenge of waste products that have generally been dumped either in rivers, because those are considered public, nothing for us to worry about, or in the air, nothing for us to worry about, or in other countries. Less developed countries were willing to accept our waste, and so we threw our waste across to poorer countries. These, of course, raise all kinds of big issues, particularly the issue of global warming. And there is the concern that many of the diseases that are now springing up, including COVID, are the result of massive human intervention in the environment, a topic that we'll come to. But to start us off on that, we have Calvin Beisner, Dr. Calvin Beisner. Cal, could you tell us a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance, which you lead?
Well, yeah, excuse me. Yes, thank you very much, Prabhu. The Cornwall Alliance is a network of just under 70 scholars, evangelical Christians. About a third of them are natural scientists, physicists, chemists, atmospheric scientists, climatologists, and the like. About a third are economists and what we in America call policy wonks. And then another third are theologians, philosophers, ethicists, ministry leaders. And we exist for the purpose of educating the public and policymakers on three things simultaneously and interconnected. One of those is what we call biblical earth stewardship, in which we want to teach and encourage people to work together in love to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. The creator of the world, we should worship and adore, and we should want to use his world in a way that glorifies him. And the second is economic development for the very poor around the world. We see this as depending on a variety of different social institutions that perhaps we can go into later, as well as access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, because everything that we produce, we need energy to produce. And then the third is the good news of the possibility of our being reconciled with the creator of the universe, despite the fact that all of us fail. I fail. We do things that we know we ought not to do, and we don't do things we know we ought to. And we have a judge, and yet he has offered us a way of being reconciled with him through faith in his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who bore our sins, our wrongdoings, in his death on the cross, and rose from the dead, literally rose from the dead. And as we come to believe in him, to trust him, we can be reconciled to our God and Father.
That you deal with, and some of them many people would regard as being incredible or impossible or unbelievable, and many of them people would say, oh yeah, that's obvious, that's motherhood and apple pie. I can relate to that straight away. Maybe it's so ordinary that it doesn't even need to be said. So there's a huge range of things that you relate to, that you're trying to accomplish, and of course there's a very diverse group of people that is involved. Is it a great challenge for you as the founder and as the man who's sort of organizing the whole thing? Is it not a huge challenge for one person to be doing all this?
Yes, it's also a very exciting challenge. I've always been, I call myself an intellectual mutt. A mixed breed of all sorts of different kinds, a mongrel. And so I've done a lot of study in philosophy and theology and history, in science, in economics, and so on. I've written several books in those fields. And so for me, it's just a delightfully fun task to be bringing together the insights of all these scholars of different specializations and helping them to harmonize, to work in cooperation with each other. So when I can bring together an atmospheric physicist and a historian and a theologian and have them all talking to each other, that's just great fun for me.
David, and David, thank you for joining us, of course, David, taking time from your very onerous responsibilities and significant responsibilities as the man who's looking after the Elders Foundation. Tell us about the Elders Foundation. What is it?
Well, the Elders are a group of about a dozen former global leaders, originally pulled together by Nelson Mandela in 2007. They work on peace and justice and human rights. Most of them are former presidents or prime ministers of their countries. We also have we have had two former UN Secretary Generals and one or two others who have demonstrated ethical leadership in the course of holding office and are now trying to encourage current leaders to lead better than they might otherwise do. Their work is supported by a secretariat, and I run the secretariat that supports their work and that also suggests what it might be.
So that's, again, a very challenging responsibility, David, that you have. What are the kinds of things that the Elders Foundation does to encourage people in high political office to do, shall we say, broadly the right thing rather than the not so right thing?
Well, if you're a former head of state, you can't threaten to invade their country or impose trade sanctions or offer them a trade deal or anything like that. You can only use moral persuasion and, if you will, appeal to the better instincts that they may have. And that can be done in a variety of ways, from private letters or phone calls to appearing in public at an event, entirely at the moment, of course, that is on screen, to publishing an op-ed or an article or doing a podcast. And then, of course, in non-COVID times, there would be the most intensive work, which is to go and meet them in person and talk with them. So, for example, a year and a half ago, the elders had a meeting with President Xi Jinping to discuss some of our concerns about global affairs and get his response to those, and with other members of the Chinese leadership. But we've also met with President Macron and President Ramaphosa and President Jokowi, so quite a range of people internationally.
Do you find that at certain times people are more open, and at key times when you want to and need to speak to them and are desperate to speak to them to make sure that they're going to do the right thing, you can't actually get in?
Well, of course. And many leaders are probably not terribly interested in hearing from the elders. And sometimes you can see the consequences, perhaps if they're not listening not only to our group, but generally perhaps not taking as much advice as they would. There's a lot of tradition in most global religious traditions about the wisdom of listening to others. So the elders would try to look for the right opportunity when there is a moment when the person might be more open to hearing. Or there might be times when the elders feel that there's little prospect of that in the foreseeable future. So we then might be a little more public about our comments than we would if we were having private conversations.
And there have been one or two rather, shall we say, striking occasions when the elders have chosen to, for example, publish an opinion piece or an advertisement.
Yes, we've published some things about, for example, universal health coverage in India. Citing some of the work done by one of the opposition parties, as it happens, in Delhi State, the Malanga clinics. And we've also published encouraging President Jokowi in Indonesia to continue nationally what he did when he was governor of one state.
Yes.
And we've also published things being often emphasizing the importance of upholding the rule of law and including international law. So when there are countries ranging from the UK, my own country at the moment, to Israel with the threat of annexing parts of the West Bank, and so on, the elders might comment on the importance of upholding international law and respecting that and finding ways to solve problems which are agreed by the key parties involved. I think you're muted, Prabhu.
Am I? Oh, I should not be now. I think there you have, David, don't you, the essential problem with global organizations of any sort at any time. And that is that they depend on not just consent, but they depend on consent which is followed through. So if you have an organization like the United Nations and a country signs up to the United Nations but has no intention of sticking with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, let us say, or perhaps initially had it, and then due to a change of government or for whatever other reasons decides to go against the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, there is nothing that the United Nations can do about it. And this, of course, is exemplified in all international organizations, including your own, isn't it?
Well, the Elders are certainly not an international organization that can do something to impose or enforce anything, nor would we wish to do so. The United Nations does have mechanisms to impose consequences on countries. The UN Security Council can agree on sanctions, for example, and has done so on a number of occasions. There are sanctions under the Iran nuclear deal on Iran. Not the UN directly, but if we think of the World Trade Organization, that has mechanisms to enforce the agreements that countries have come to about the basis on which they will trade with each other. So we do have ways of enforcing things internationally. These
But again,
aren't always effective, however.
Well, this is always the issue, isn't it? The United Nations can say we impose sanctions on Iran, but if country X or country Y doesn't want to accept that ruling, that decision, there is nothing to prevent them breaking the sanction. And we have seen that, of course, again and again, that countries that officially belong to the United Nations don't accept the sanctions or accept them at face value somehow officially, but really are behind the scenes breaking the sanctions. And the same applies in other cases as well. But please carry on. You were going to say something.
Well, firstly, just about every country in the world belongs to the United Nations, so there are very few exceptions. Secondly, this is not a problem that is unique to international matters. Most countries have police forces that try to enforce the law, and one of the reasons those are needed is because people don't always obey the law. And sometimes it's very difficult to enforce. So I don't think we should think this is a problem unique to international relations. It's a problem of human relations, about how we humans relate to each other. And as Calvin alluded earlier, we do things that we shouldn't do, and we don't do things that we should do. And this applies not only to individuals, but to families and to communities and to countries and so on.
But the key point is that the United Nations does not have a police force of its own, and therefore it can't even try to impose what it wants to do, whereas a government can, if it wishes, send its police forces in if its law is being violated. And that is one key difference, isn't it, between a national government and an international organization like the United Nations?
It is a difference, but it's not an absolute difference. We've seen in Belarus at the moment that the government is sending in the police to try to impose their will, but they're not being able to do it. The police in the United States have struggled to cope with some of the recent outbreaks of violence. One could go on and on. This is often the case. And as I said, there are mechanisms that the United Nations can use, but in the end, this has to be done on the basis of consent. If a government withdraws, the United Nations can't impose, though the members of the UN could impose consequences on that other member of the UN for its breach of agreements. And indeed, this is happening at the moment in relation to a number of countries, including, for example, Iran and North Korea. So it is possible to do this where there is consent, even if the country doesn't agree. And then again, just to make to point out the analogy, where you have a country, it's very difficult to police without consent. This can be done, but it requires sometimes extremely draconian consequences and many breaches of human rights if you want to impose on an unaccepting population sanctions when they're not doing what the government wants them to do. And of course, democracy as a principle or a system, which it sort of underpins the workings of the UN. The UN tries to operate on democratic principles, and many governments in the world try to, not all. There is an element of requiring consent, but that has to be balanced with leadership.
So that is one issue, of course, consent and how you get agreement around your stated ideals, goals, or whatever. A second issue, of course, is that of finance. So the United Nations and indeed most international organizations suffer, don't they, from having a vision which is huge and a budget which is not quite as huge.
Well, many of them do. Though, if you look at the vision set out in the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, of what the world could be like in 2030. Actually, if you read it, it's a wonderfully inspiring forward to that or start document. It doesn't read like a typical UN document at all. It reads very exciting about the possible, what it would be possible for we humans to achieve working together. Of course, to achieve those doesn't just require governments to act. It doesn't just require the UN to act. It requires all of us to act. We all have some responsibility in the actions, the decisions we take. But governments are charged with particular responsibilities, quite onerous responsibilities. And those relate, it seems to me, not only to their own people, but to the commitments that we share together as humans if we are to protect public goods, to share common goods that enrich all our lives. That's important, whether it's about an intellectual property system that enables medicines to be invented or discovered and made available to everybody, or whether it's about the rules on which international trade happens, or how we contain the risk of nuclear proliferation and warfare, or how we ensure that the atmosphere doesn't get polluted either with particulates, little bits that damage our lungs, or carbon dioxide that heats up our planet. So there are many things here where we share a common interest in achieving common goods for everybody, and there's an onus on all governments to participate on behalf of all people, all of whom will benefit.
Well, in theory, of course, you're right, but in practice, of course, this is hardly ever the case. So if you look at the history of the United Nations, it was not only founded under US leadership, it was also financed primarily by the US. And if you look at the situation today, it is still the case that the bulk of UN financing comes from the United States. And the second largest economy in the world, China, for example, contributed just 1% of the budget to the World Health Organization in 2018-2019. And you find these kinds of anomalies all over the place in the United Nations. And I suggest you find them all over all kinds of international organizations. In fact, if you looked at your own organization, David, or indeed Calvin, you'd probably find that the bulk of the financing comes from a very small number of participants, and not all the members are actually carrying the weight equally, or even in proportion to their, to the wealth that they might be commanding. So that's a very interesting issue that is raised by when you look at what people actually do in terms of supporting their verbal commitments. But can I just turn to Cal at this point, if you don't mind, and bring Cal in? Cal, you have a particular interest, of course, in the International Panel on Climate Change, a topic that was just raised by David. You have a somewhat skeptical attitude to the IPCC. Could you tell us why? Well, first of all, whether you do, this is just my deduction from what I've seen. And secondly, if you do, why?
Well, I think the first thing that I would simply say is that there is a huge difference, an enormous difference between what most of the public sees from journalistic reporting and whatnot around the world about the findings of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and those actual findings themselves. As I read the technical reports of the IPCC, and of course they're working now on preparing the sixth assessment report. And in fact, some of Cornwall Alliance's scholars are involved in that as expert reviewers. Some of our climate scientists and economists and whatnot. As I read their technical reports, they tend to give a spectrum of what answers to the question, for example, how much warming, how much increase in global average surface temperature is to be expected if we add such and such an amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And they will give, in the fifth assessment report that came out in 2013, they said, well, it's a range from 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. And they actually didn't give a best estimate in that assessment report. But since then, a variety of different studies have suggested that the more likely is that it's going to be in the lower half of that range rather than in the upper half. But news media, and I'm a former newspaper reporter, editor, and publisher. My father was a newspaper journalist all his life. And there's a saying in journalism and in media in general that bad news is good news is no news. And the reason for that is that there is something about the human psyche that takes much greater interest in being told of some terrible threat than in being told that there's something good going on, right? And so the bad news stories hit the front page, are featured on the homepage of the media websites and so on. The good news stories tend to get buried or never appear at all. So in terms of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Cornwall Alliance would be supporting those or agreeing more with those who are saying, yeah, CO2, certainly it's an infrared absorbing gas, a greenhouse gas. It does have a tendency to warm the surface of the Earth and to cool the stratosphere, by the way. But we tend to think, and this is because we have scientists who are focusing more on empirical observation than on computer modeling, that the warming effect of added CO2 in the atmosphere is probably much less than appears from the general media treatment, but probably in that lower range of the IPCC's range. So as a result, because the media tend to focus on the upper end and the potential disastrous consequences of that, and frankly, very, very few decision makers in any governments read the technical reports of the IPCC. They may read the summary for policymakers, which itself is, I think, at least as much a political document as a scientific document. We tend to see policies focused on the potentially catastrophic results, where in fact the much greater likelihood is for the far less catastrophic and in some ways very good results. Even the IPCC, for example, says that in a business as usual scenario in terms of CO2 emissions, that is, if nothing were done by any nations, which is a crazy hypothesis anyway, because many nations are doing something, but if nothing were done to reduce emissions, even in that scenario, the average income for people in in countries by the end of this century that were extremely poor at this time will be very close to the average income in the United States today, if not slightly above it. And when you have that kind of income, you can adapt to pretty much any kind of climate or any kind of weather. Frankly, we already have people living from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert and the Brazilian rainforest. If you're extremely poor, you can't thrive in any climate. If you are reasonably wealthy, you can adapt and thrive in a wide variety of climates.
Well, Calvin,
so
I
we're
feel like
very
saying
concerned that we not slow economic development around the world.
Yeah, I feel like saying, well, tell that to the Californians this morning who have who have ash raining down on them and fires all around them destroying property.
May I address that? Because I lived in California for 15 years. I experienced the wildfires there at the time in Southern California. Most that are going on right now are in Northern. But for fire to take place in a forest, you need three things. You need fuel, you need oxygen, and you need ignition. Ignition doesn't take place below 451 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't happen to know what that is in Celsius, but it doesn't take place that way. Ignition is the key to starting the fires. And the increase in temperature in California over the years has not been anywhere near enough to cause any ignition. The real issue driving the fires in California has been the lack of forest management, allowing massive buildup of undergrowth and the failure to remove that undergrowth, so that there's an enormous amount of fuel there. And when the fires get started by a lightning strike or by arsonists, which has been the case with some of them, then they rage far more fiercely than they otherwise would. And frankly,
but Calvin, the
global temperature has little to do with it.
Yes, Calvin, but the issue is that if the world's richest country, or certainly one of the world's richest countries, cannot manage its own forests, as a result of which large tracts of some of the most prosperous parts of the United States are being burnt, and then what chance is there for poorer nations to be able to manage their forests or anything else for that matter?
Well, historically, we can see, for example, that both the numbers of wildfires and the total area consumed by wildfires in the United States were far higher. We're talking 10, 15, 20 times higher in the 1920s, 1930s than they have been in the 1950s through 1990s. It was not a matter of a change in weather patterns that brought this about. It was a matter of a change in policy about what to do with forest areas that said basically we want to suppress all fires. In America, we've had a campaign called "Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires," and there's a mascot for it, Smokey the Bear, and the idea has been to prevent as many fires as possible. That has been itself what has resulted in the massive buildup of undergrowth that makes these fires so much more intense when they start. It really hasn't been a matter of how much can you afford. It's been a matter of, are you going to prevent the natural re-burning of various areas that has happened through centuries and thus allow the buildup of the undermatter? Or are you going to allow that to happen, yet control it at the edges? So I just think that actually climate change has next to nothing to do with it.
But if you take a bigger issue, such as the breaking of the Arctic shelf, which was anticipated, according to the IPCC and other scientists, to be not foreseeable in the non-foreseeable future, but is already happening. And if you look at the depletion of the Amazon forest, which is, of course, not a primary issue from climate change, but is a contributor to climate change, if you believe in that, as a result of human activity chopping down these forests, how would you respond to that?
Well, let's take the two separately. Yeah. First off, at the very same time that we've seen a decline in Arctic, that is North Polar sea ice, we've been watching a steady or inclining amount of Antarctic sea ice. And this seems, as we look back at historical data, to be a fairly cyclical and what's the term for it? It bounces back and forth between the two poles, having to do with major ocean currents that have cycles running anywhere from the El Nino Southern Oscillation of about 8 to 12 or 13 years to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation running about, on average, about 30 years, to the Atlantic Oscillation and so on. These things seem to be far more directly related to the amounts of sea ice and to the amounts of land ice toward the poles than anything about global average temperature. Now, that doesn't mean that the change in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has not contributed to that. And in fact, the greenhouse warming theory tells us that as CO2 concentration rises in the atmosphere, the warming will happen primarily toward the poles, primarily in winter, and primarily at night. That is, low temperatures are raised, high temperatures don't tend to be raised as much. So this is not terribly surprising, and I work with a variety of different so-called skeptic scientists about this, and they don't contest this at all. They're actually quite well within the IPCC's way of thinking about these things. When we move to what was your second issue again now?
I was looking at the Amazon and the destruction of forests in the Amazon, which is a human activity, which then contributes to, for example, climate change or disease.
Sure, yeah. 2 points about that. Here's another example of how the media tend to do the bad news is good news is no news thing. The idea that the Amazon was the lungs of the earth spread around global media rather intensely not too long ago. And it was based on the realization that, of course, as trees grow, they fix. That is, they consume carbon dioxide and they keep it from being in the atmosphere. The trouble is, though, that the Amazon rainforest it puts out essentially as much carbon dioxide as it takes in. It's an in and out sort of system. This is one of the areas where my own individual study has not been in depth, but some of the scientists who work with us have been working on this. And so the actual contribution of decline in area of Amazon rainforest to CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is almost nothing. And then two, we have to recognize that deforestation happens historically during periods of early economic development in countries. And as those countries become less and less dependent on slash and burn of forested area to add agricultural land, as they become increasingly industrialized and farmers become wealthy enough to use chemical fertilizers and industrial tractors and things like that, deforestation slows and stops and tends to reverse. Now, it's not an automatic thing. There are differing values among the peoples of differing countries. This is just exactly what you and David were talking about before. There has to be consent. People have to be willing to think about these things. But it's been a very, very clear historical trend that deforestation tends to slow, stop, and reverse as countries become increasingly economic.
Well, I would say that's mainly because the manufacturing activity has so far been shipped off to other countries, And therefore, the effect, the reason for deforestation doesn't need to be in your own country. It can be shipped off to other countries, so other countries continue the deforestations rather than your country. I mean, India is a very good example of that, and various Southeast Asian countries are good examples of the deforestation continuing at a much faster pace because, of course...
One of our scholars working with us is Vijay Jayaraj. He is Indian. He lives in Delhi. He works actually with one of the government environmental agencies there. And he just recently wrote an article for us on the Cornwall Alliance's website that mentioned the fact that, in fact, there has been a net increase in forested area in India.
In theory, maybe. In theory, maybe, but in fact, when you go into the forest, there are no forests there. So officially, it's a forest area, but you go in and there's no forest left because all the trees have been illegally logged and cleared out. So there's a huge difference between official figures and the reality in many countries, not just in India, of course. But anyway, I wanted us to have enough time to explore the differences between us in terms of the different points of view represented and so on. But I want to bring us back to the key question. So from our point of view, does the United Nations need reform? Does the International Panel on Climate Change need reform? And if so, in what way? What kinds of reforms are needed? David, maybe you want to start us off. Can't hear you, David. Yeah.
The United Nations certainly needs to be reformed. And I think you can look at what the issues are, partly in terms of effectiveness. Is it effective? And there are aspects of the UN which are, but there are aspects which are not. Now, if we take a current topical example of the World Health Organization, which is part of the wider UN system, it's been effective in some respects, but clearly not effective sufficiently to help the world manage this pandemic. Having said that, we should recognize that, for example, a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, in September last year, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which is co-chaired by one of the elders, which is a subsidiary body of the World Health Organization and the World Bank, issued a report in which it said one of the big risks to the world was a respiratory pathogen being spread by human-to-human transmission, and that governments were ill-prepared, and we didn't have the systems ready to address that. In fact, they just on Monday published their second report, in which they say, it's very sad to be right in what they said a year ago. So is there need for reform? Yes, there certainly is. And one of the other areas I would highlight that needs reform is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council's job is to maintain global security, and in particular to tackle conflicts. But it's not been doing that effectively. We have only to look around the world, and we see conflicts, ranging from Yemen to Syria, etc., etc. Now, why is the UN Security Council, or indeed the WHO, not as effective as they should be? And that links to the other aspect of reform, which in my view is legitimacy, which is about composition, about governance, about how these things operate. And this is not always a very comfortable area for us to address. You pointed out, Prabhu, that the United States is the single largest contributor to, or should be, to the UN. But absolutely, and so it should. It's the richest country in the world, so it should be the largest. Now, we can debate by how much, but there's no problem in it being the largest single contributor, in my view. On the other hand, if China is making a contribution which is based on historical categorizations which are no longer so appropriate, there's clearly a need for that to be revised. And the whole system has got bogged down in this, and that's exacerbated or illustrated. You can see this in the Security Council. There are 15 members of the Security Council. 10 of them are elected on a regional basis by the countries in, the Americas or Africa or Europe or Asia and so on. But 5 of them are there permanently: the United States, Russia, China, France, and Great Britain. Now, 2 of those stand out as extremely strange, Britain and France, in the current era. Interestingly, neither Britain nor France use their veto, which all the permanent members have, but the United States and Russia and China all use their veto and the threat of it to stop the UN Security Council being able to be effective in passing resolutions and agreeing to take action together, countries to take action together, to address conflicts. And so reform is needed. But, as I said, reform may not always be comfortable because, as you pointed out, Prabhu, the current structure of the UN reflects that it was formed in 1945 after the war. It's dominated by, the then powers. China was recognized as an upcoming power with a huge population and increasing global significance. But, the second most populous country in the world, India, isn't on the Security Council. And, one can go on about the difficulties in that. And the elders, by the way, have historically made proposals for the reform of the UN, the reform of the way the Secretary General is appointed. Some of those were introduced in the last round, and particularly reform of the Security Council, because that's needed. But in the end, we've got to find a way, if we humans are to manage the common benefits that the created world provides for us, we've got to find a way in which people feel that their country has a say, there's participation. Secondly, that everyone obeys the rules, there's behavior and consequences from bad behavior, and that we all pay our way, that contributions are made in an appropriate way. But I want to end this point by saying, but we desperately need institutions, international institutions, that are effective and that are legitimate if we are going to live well on in the world.
So the question that you're raising, of course, David, is that many people are over optimistic or over pessimistic in relation to international organizations. And what you're saying is that we do need reform. We shouldn't be over pessimistic about them. But at the same time, we shouldn't be over pessimistic about them, because we need to look at the question of effectiveness of these organizations. We need to look at the question of legitimacy, and that, of course, it relates to your point about the Security Council. If these changes were made, Cal, how would you feel about an organization like the UN?
Well, I start with the recognition that I need reform, and so it should be no surprise to any of us that any organization always needs reform. This is just the human condition, as we talked about earlier. David mentioned the importance of democratic means of decision making. And, I tend to think that the consent of the governed is a very important principle, and that consent needs to be as substantive as possible, rather than just sort of theoretical and abstract. For that reason, I tend to be the sort who thinks that as much as possible, governing decisions should be kept as local as possible. That doesn't mean that that there are no decisions that need to be made on a regional or national or even a global basis. But I think that in many instances, we would find the United Nations and its various agencies being more effective if they were to carefully distinguish between issues that might be handled the most effectively on a local level, and then just say, okay, then we're going to get out of that. We're not going to address that.
Well, the United Nations mostly does that. The United Nations is not involved in anything on the ground except peacekeeping And the only thing it does in terms of peacekeeping is obviously with international consent, with armies and navies and air forces loaned by other countries and so on. It doesn't have any of its own. So largely, it is not in the business of doing anything on the ground. The WHO is a very good example of that with its preparedness and so on. It issues bulletins for countries to react to if they wish, but it is entirely dependent on local governments putting in the information on the basis of which they say, yeah, we've got a pandemic or whatever.
Well,
and they don't police what happens or anything like that.
Let me give you a concrete example, though, of what I have in mind, and that has to do with the climate control, climate response. As the United Nations worked out the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, now the independent national contributions are voluntary. There is not an enforcement mechanism at this stage, but it's been very clear from the start of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then the development of the Kyoto Protocol, and then Paris, that the aim is to have various different parts of these become enforceable internationally. So, for example, the pressure to move from hydrocarbon fuels to wind and solar is being pushed upon countries that do not have the economic level of development yet where they can afford that. So that the UN, the World Bank, the IMF have agreed, for instance, not to finance the building of new coal-fired power plants in southern Africa. And yet, frankly, when your primary cooking and heating fuel is wood and dried dung, replacement of that by the world's dirtiest coal-fired power plant, which, by the way, I'm not promoting, but I'm just saying the effect on human health of that exchange would be tremendously beneficial. And it's not that we have to build the world's dirtiest coal-fired power plant, but we can get electricity to people much more quickly, much more affordably, and thus clean their indoor air, clean their cooking systems, all of these things, and bring huge benefits to human health. But the Paris Climate Agreement stands in the way of that. And
so let me just
should be free to make their own decisions about how they make the transition.
Sure. You made the point, Cal. Thank you, David. Should then these kinds of decisions be enforceable globally in the kind of way that Cal has just been suggesting has already been happening?
Well, I mean, Cal, you talked about the Paris Agreement being sort of enforceable, but we were talking earlier about one part of the challenge for the whole UN system is that there are not many enforceable mechanisms. So the pressure is more coming from civil society movements and from businesses and international institutions, each making their own decision about whether they will finance whatever it is, coal power stations, for example. And I think given the risks of climate change, and of course, as Cal has pointed out, there are significant uncertainties about the trajectory of global temperatures and rainfall patterns and so on. But there are nevertheless very serious risks to very large numbers of people. It makes sense to look at opportunities to shift not from dung and local wood and so on to dirty coal power stations, but to shift right through to sustainable sources of energy. And well, maybe I'll tell you a story. I had a meeting with a UK government energy minister some years ago, and I was discussing with him about the UK's policies and so on. And then he said to me, I understand you believe in God. So I was a bit taken aback by this because government ministers don't usually do that. I don't know if you've looked at my CV and seen I have a couple of theology degrees as well as one in finance. Anyway, so I said, well, yes, I do. He said, well, what about God? How does God get into all this? You see, so I said, I don't know. I don't have a guaranteed line on this, but one perspective might be that God made sure there was enough fossil fuels to get the Industrial Revolution going, and these fuels were easily available without much difficulty in accessing them, and so on. And the Industrial Revolution has brought all kinds of benefits to humanity. But some of the other fossil fuels, he made sure were in very, very difficult and dangerous places to get them, and instead made sure that we've got the sun and the moon, very obvious there, sunlight hitting us, wind blowing at us, waves crashing, current, tides flowing, and so on. And you'd sort of think, well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that there's lots of sources of energy, as well as wood, and as was pointed out earlier, good forest management can give a sources of wood for energy as well on a sustainable basis. There's lots of good sources of energy that don't have this climate impact. I was a bit puzzled as to why on earth we persist in going after this very difficult, dangerous stuff rather than using the readily to hand, very obvious sources that are presented to us, and which, because of the Industrial Revolution, we've now got the technology to harness those forms of energy. So what I'd like to see in Southern Africa or anywhere else would be a new approach to energy that doesn't require deep mining of coal and so on, but uses the sun, the wind, the waves, the tides, the sustainably using or indeed other sources volcanic that can enable humans to have access to the energy we need in a basis that doesn't have the risks that fossil fuels place for heating the planet.
issue we're discussing, of course, is the degree to which international organizations should encourage it or penalize countries that don't move in this direction or enable countries to actually move in this direction. That's the question we're discussing, isn't it? To what extent are these international organizations doing it, and to what extent should they do it? And if they're doing it, in what ways should they do it? So given the fact that they've not been very effective, given the fact that whatever they do is sometimes ham-handed and counterproductive, what specific changes do you think are needed to get the balance right between pushing too hard or pushing the wrong way and not pushing at all?
I'm assuming you're addressing that to me as well before you...
Oh, well, yeah, David, you can start and then Cal will come in. No, please do.
Okay, yeah. Well, firstly, I think the pressure on climate change is now very diffuse. It's coming from international institutions, but it's also coming from people and everyday people. It's coming from businesses looking at their business models and so on. So I think international institutions have a role in that, particularly, I think, in enabling the transformation, which Cal referred to, of how modern energy, power systems, electricity can transform people's lives. And by the way, in addition to being chief executive at the Elders, I'm also the senior independent director on the board of a UK power generation company that has moved from coal to sustainable biomass precisely to do this. And because I do believe that modern sources of energy, particularly electricity that's generated appropriately, can transform people's lives. So what we need is the financial institutions to provide the investment. We need them also to help with the governance of these systems. We've seen in some countries, for example, South Africa, the problems when you have Eskom there, not being run effectively and well for the benefit of the people of the country, and the consequences of that. And when I lived in India, power breakdowns result in huge numbers of diesel generators churning out horrendous pollution around the place. So this is badly needed. International institutions can work with and collaborate with governments to help them on this transition path, and to do so in a way which is quicker than it would be, and also keeps prices down, because price is also important, particularly for poorer people. And fortunately, we're now at a place where solar power and wind power in different parts of the world, it depends where you are, is now comparable to fossil fuel power. Of course, we're still working on the storage challenges we have, but for a lot of people who don't currently have access to power, I think institutions need to facilitate a different model, not a sort of single national grid where masses of electricity is shipped around, but much more local production and small quantity storage. And of course, you see in households the transformation of having access to light in the evening, which doesn't require huge power backup, but requires some. And we now have the technology to do that.
So what you've just been saying, David, is no doubt music to the ears of a gentleman or lady who identifies herself or himself on the WhatsApp feed as Reformation Boy. And the point he or she was making was decentralized power is better because centralized power breeds corruption and abuse of power. So it wasn't just the point you were making, it was the additional point that centralization does lend itself to abuse of power and corruption.
But, yes, but just to say, I mean, you have to look at what's appropriate in the circumstances. I mean, some places, some centralization of power systems would be sensible, particularly in small, densely populated countries. Singapore, for example, you'd hardly want it devolved there. Other places, it makes less sense. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all on that.
Cal, you were going to come in on this question of whether we can at all ensure that global organizations, world organizations, contribute in the right way and not in inappropriate ways to moving us all on in the right direction.
Yeah, I would suggest that one of the things that needs to happen is that, and I'm focusing primarily on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. One of the things that needs to happen is that it needs to hear better the voices of thoroughly qualified experts who do not necessarily embrace the what is typically thought of as the conventional or the consensus view. It needs to be very careful not to sideline other voices. As an example, Dr. Chris Landsea, one of the world's leading experts on hurricanes, resigned from the IPCC in protest in 2000, I believe it was 6 or 7, during the preparation of the 4th assessment report, because he saw what had been done by the chapter lead author on hurricanes and said, no, this does not reflect the actual data, does not reflect the underlying technical work that we did. There was a major change here by the lead author, and I have not been able to get the lead author to revise. So he resigned, and the IPCC has had a number of different situations like that, where people have simply dropped out of the process because they've realized their voices are not being heard at all. And I think it's very important that the IPCC be much more inclusive of a diversity of views than it has been in its editorial and authorial process.
Toss that question to David, if I may. David, are there other such instances that you can think of? Cal is mentioning the IPCC, where certain voices have been marginalized or excluded. Are there other examples of international organizations where this sort of thing happens? So this would be another issue in the area of governance, really. If the right governance is not in place, then of course these kinds of things are more likely to happen.
Let me respond to that, and then just very quickly, 3 quick points in response to things Cal said. On that point, yes, I mean, I think the UN system struggles with hearing the voices, for example, of smaller countries. There are mechanisms to address that. For example, the G77, the group of 77 countries, generally smaller countries, and poorer countries try to get together to work out what would they want to say together that represents the consensus across all of them. And that's a very important mechanism. Of course, it has the danger that some minority voices within that group don't get heard because only the group voices get heard. Just to pick up and follow on and to some degree agree and reinforce what Cal was saying. I mean, I think this point about minority voices is frankly not particular to the IPCC or indeed to international institutions. I think one of the alarming things in the world is our struggling with dealing with how do we deal with people we disagree with, and how do we allow people to have a voice? Now, I think there are limits to that. You know, people trying to persuade other people to kill other people. I think we have to find ways of saying no. There are limits to that freedom. But generally, the advent of social media has many good things to be said about it, but it hasn't, I don't think, helped constructive, thoughtful, reflective dialogue that is respectful of others. So I think this is a much wider problem. Secondly, I wanted to just reinforce what he said much earlier in the conversation, which was about this problem of you have a technical report, but then you have the news and the media and how this is presented. And I think this is also a very challenging thing for us. Partly it's exacerbated by our media business models, which, and I include social media, all of which are that the revenues relate to the attention that people give them, whether that's for advertising revenues or in other forms. But so they're looking for human attention, and so they will seek to come up with things that grab your attention, that make you want to find out more. And so things that say that there's lots of good news don't tend to get the attention. And by the way, you know, over the last 50 years, you know, huge numbers of people have moved out of poverty. There are far more people educated. There's lots of good news around, but this gets less attention.
That's been fabulous. Yeah.
And finally, my third point on this is I think the COVID-19 is an interesting example of this, where around the world, governments are grappling with, we have science and we have a lot and increasing amounts on COVID of evidence, but we also have uncertainty. How do we come up with public policy that is true to the science and is based on science and what evidence we have, that recognizes uncertainty, but still says we have to act. We can't just wait until, you know, until we know everything about COVID. We have to make decisions now, but they won't be perfect.
You never will know everything.
They won't be perfect decisions, but they'll be better decisions. And I think that the nature of political dialogue on that has got quite difficult. And here we see it in something that relates not as climate change does. I mean, climate change relates to ordinary people and impacts them, but it doesn't have that immediate effect on potentially on your own body in the sort of short term that could kill you or cause very great damage to you or your loved ones or whatever. Here we have this, and we have science about it, but only so much. And governments are making different decisions, reflecting uncertainties, other pressures, political ideologies, etc., etc.
So that raises, of course, the wider question of the increasing skepticism about science and the increasing skepticism about experts, some of which is now nationally enshrined in many countries, where just because you're a scientist, you will not be heard, or just because you're an expert, you will not be heard, simply because you're a scientist, or simply because you're an expert. We far prefer ignorance to that kind of knowledge. In many countries, this has become institutionalized. So that's one issue I'd like to raise with you. How is that, do you think, affecting, how do you think that is going to affect things like this whole tension between the way international organizations try to move us, we hope mostly in the right direction, and the way in which national organizations sometimes are happy to go along with that and sometimes resist or indeed oppose or subvert what's going on?
That is That's a really tough challenge. On the one hand, yes, there are the places where people are just automatically saying, if you're a scientist, if you're an expert, therefore we don't believe you because we have some sort of a suspicion that you've got some agenda that you are pushing, and you're talking like a scientist, though you're not really acting like one. There are other places where just simply to say, follow the science is itself a sort of an idolatrous attitude. We idolize scientists in many ways. And it seems like those two things are both happening often in the very same societies, and sometimes with the same individual. On some issues, that individual will have high respect for the science and scientists who say this about an issue, but total disregard for the scientists who say something competing about that same issue. And so I think part of what I am hoping to communicate to a lot of people through the work of the Cornwall Alliance is, first of all, on any given issue, there is not the science. There is what these scientists say, and there is what these scientists say. And real science constantly welcomes testing. As a follower of Jesus, as a follower of Jesus, one of his disciples, the Apostle Paul, wrote in a letter to the church in Thessalonica. He said, "Test all things, hold fast what is good." That is the essence of science, and so we need simultaneously, I think, to welcome a wider hearing of scientists who dissent from various different consensuses, and indeed, consensus is not even a scientific value; it's a political value. You find out who won an election by counting votes. You don't find out, the specific gravity of a particular object by counting votes. So we need a wide openness to hearing a variety of scientists. We also the notion of uncertainties is very important, and most of our media don't get that at all. They just want the simplest thing that they can get across, and somehow or other, we have to work toward generating an appreciation of uncertainties that says, okay, now I see there are these various different arguments. I need to think that through for myself, rather than just depending on some authorities.
I think the problem of sensationalism in the media is not a problem we're going to solve in the short run, and is certainly not a problem that is in principle solvable with privately owned media. It's only if you've got media which are owned by neutral-ish bodies concerned with communicating the range of issues and the range of opinions that you were talking about, that we'll get anywhere. So
we need to recognize, though, that politicians are equally liable to be sensationalist.
No, but the point is, if the Cornwall Alliance has educational media, it is likely to be representing the kind of diversity of view you're talking about, rather than any privately owned media. So, yes. But anyway, we are running out of time, so I want to raise one more question, and the other question that I want to raise is in relation to corporate power and the way in which corporate power is now beginning to distort public policy decisions, not just at national level, but at international level. Any responses to that fact of corporate lobbying and how corporate lobbying is changing, influencing multinational governments as well as national governments? David? I can't hear you at present. I'm not sure what's happening. Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay. So my screen was suddenly showing various other things. I was wondering what was what was happening. And the people
probably my fault.
Right. Yeah. In terms of the corporate thing, firstly, sorry, Prabhu, I do want to say I don't think it is the case that, as Carl indicated, that simply people are rejecting science and so on. I think it's a much more mixed picture And when a bridge collapses, people want to know who the engineer was that did the calculations, because we expect them to do the science properly so that we can travel across bridges safely. And if you have your appendix being taken out, you probably want it done by a trained doctor who knows the science of how to do that, not by somebody who sort of likes taking pictures of appendices or something. So I think it's much more mixed. But now to come to this question about corporate influence, I think that is a danger. But just to be clear, that doesn't mean that corporates should be sort of removed from the picture. Corporations play a very important part in the world. The issues, I think, are around two or three things. One is scale. That some corporations now are so huge that the power relationship with governments is very difficult. And also the Adam Smith model of lots of people competing equally with equal information doesn't really apply. What's the alternative to Facebook? Well, there may be one, but there aren't very many. I don't have a choice of 20 potential suppliers. So I think this makes it much more difficult, and that's not the fault of the individual businesses, just because they're big or that the market they're in has some of these natural monopolistic tendencies, but they need to be regulated, and we need to manage how their influence is deployed. Secondly, there's the transparency issue. Are businesses being open about what they're advocating for, and both what they're doing directly and also how they are influencing their trade organizations and so on. And thirdly, there's the money issue. I think one description, if you'll allow me, of the United States is that it has the best democracy that money can buy. And it is horrifying that the amount of money that has become involved in political power, and I think we need to look at ways to manage that so that we are valuing people rather than dollars, and we're saying what matters is how humans are being affected by this, not just how money is being affected by political decisions.
So there's scale, there's transparency, and there's money, three issues in relation to that. And I'm sure we could keep on discussing that, but we have just about 10, 12 minutes left before we conclude. And I should thank the two of you very much for your participation and your contributions. I have certainly learned a lot by listening to each of you, and I hope that is also the case for our viewers. And I particularly want to thank some of the people who raised questions. That's Bill Evans. And I'm sorry that I haven't acknowledged you each time I've picked up your questions. But you may have noticed that I was spinning your questions into what I was putting to our two panelists today. So Bill Evans, Vijay Jayaraj, Reformation Boy, Jeremy Horton, Nakato Kisake, and Philip Sampson Powell, particularly, thank you for your questions and your contributions, which I was trying to pick up and spin into what I was asking, I hope accurately, at least the spirit of it, if not the actual words of it. I'd like to turn now, if I may, to Vishal for any concluding thoughts and for a concluding conversation with God, because we always like to talk to God before we conclude the session. Vishal.
Well, thank you, Prabhu, and thank you to both the panelists for this wonderful, enriching experience of thinking with you, because I have been part of a mindset, not that I have shared it, but many of my friends have shared it, that United Nations and these world organizations are about a one world government, a global government, antichrist, and they are to be destroyed, etc. So there has been a lot of simplistic mindset which has not realized the tremendous impact that like Prophet Isaiah had on the founding of United Nations in New York, in the UN Plaza. There is an Isaiah wall which has Isaiah chapter 2, which says that the time will come when nations will beat their swords into plowshares, and they will not learn war, but they will pursue peace. And those visions, it was a Russian artist who, or a sculptor who had the statue of a man beating a sword into a plowshare. The pursuit of peace, the Prince of Peace, will bring peace. And of course, peace includes health and well-being. And the image of swords, or the weapons of war, being turned into weapons of agriculture or instruments of agriculture and horticulture, pruning hooks, etc. So this economic development, which both the panelists have emphasized, is part of what is being attempted, that the poor are cared for and the dangers are minimized. Now, these are struggles and we don't succeed, but that our constituency, our people, need to think about these things, because there are, unfortunately, many Christians who prefer war and rumors of war instead of being peacemakers. So this participation and being able to think about the complex issues, and as both the panelists have emphasized, the need for us to study carefully, think carefully, read technical reports, and even become those who are creating these reports by doing original pioneering work. So this is very helpful, because we hope that many young people and others will watch this video over the next few years and will be stimulated to choose their own vocation and their voice. If United Nations has to have legitimacy, then it has to hear our voices, and our voices have to be informed and intelligent and thoughtful. So thank you for this very helpful input from you, and we hope that people will come and watch this over the next days, months, years, and will be stimulated to participate in making our world where nations do actually move away from destructive wars to economically productive and peaceful and healthy ways of living. So I'll be happy for us to turn to God, because that's what Isaiah actually said, that people will turn to the mountain of the Lord, seek him, his law, because he is the Prince of Peace. So let's pray and talk to God. Father, we thank you for this wonderful opportunity to have our minds stretched by experts who have been struggling to see where the world is going and ought to be going. The errors that keep coming in because of the Western interest, including the abuse of science, the abuse of expertise and ideologies in shaping the policies that many of the nations and international forums adopt. We pray for wisdom, that you will make us a people who seek the spirit of truth, spirit of wisdom and understanding and knowledge, so that the earth may be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea, and the oppressions and hunger and terror and abuse will end. That there will indeed be the peace of God expanding and filling the earth. So we thank you for this time, and we thank you for technology, and we pray that you will bless the people who have taken the time to have their minds touched today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Vishal. Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, David, for your very valuable contributions and the analysis that you've offered us. I think, as Vishal was saying, it'll be extremely helpful and useful to many people, not just who've watched today, but many others as well. May I also thank Andreas Wieland, who is overall responsible for much of what happens, and particularly for the back office, as it were, the technology and all that, even though that is specifically and practically supplied by Finn Schwartz. So thank you, Finn, to you as well. May I invite all people watching this program to put in their diaries the next of these live discussions, which will be on September the 29th at the same time. And the topic for that is the follow-on topic of, do we actually need new international organizations? If so, what sorts of international organizations are most needed? How will they be financed? How will they be structured? Will they be better governed and more useful even than the organizations we've had so far? So we've looked today at the past and the present, and next time when we meet, we'll be looking at the future, at the kinds of organizations you and I can still help to create from scratch. May I invite you, just to end with, to subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the Facebook page. And for the moment, that's all for this time. Goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Bye-bye.